Welcome to a space where heartfelt stories meet the quiet hours of night, offering you soulful tales that gently guide your mind toward rest. Let these meaningful reflections on our shared humanity wrap around you like a warm blanket, helping you drift peacefully into sleep. I know many of you find comfort in these stories as you settle in for the night, so if you feel moved to, a quiet like and subscribe would mean the world to me, and feel free to share where you're listening from and what time you're drifting off to sleep. Rest easy now and let these words unfold. Story 1. The Night Keeper. The lighthouse keeper's quarters trembled as another gust rattled the windows, salt spray kissing the glass like desperate fingers. Margaret Thorne pressed her palm against the pane, feeling the Atlantic's fury through weathered wood and iron. The storm had been building since dusk, transforming the familiar rhythm of waves against rocks into something violent and unpredictable. She withdrew her hand, noting the tremor that had nothing to do with the tempest outside. 23 years she had tended this beacon, 23 years of solitary nights watching ships pass like distant thoughts. The automated system had made her role ceremonial, a living relic maintaining tradition more than necessity, but Margaret preferred it that way. The isolation suited her, had shaped itself around the hollow spaces in her chest until loneliness felt like companionship. She climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room, her boots echoing against iron steps worn smooth by decades of ascent. The beam swept across churning waters, illuminating foam and fury before moving on, indifferent to the chaos it revealed. Margaret checked the mechanism, her fingers tracing familiar switches and gauges with the devotion of a priest tending altar candles. Everything functioned perfectly, as it always did, as it must. The radio crackled to life, startling her from routine. Static filled the small space before a voice emerged, fractured and desperate. "Mayday, Mayday, this is the Sarah's Dream. Engine failure. Taking on water." Margaret's hand froze above the response button. The voice was young, frightened, a girl's voice barely rising above the static. She pressed the transmit key. "Sarah's Dream, this is Gull Point Light. What's your position?" I don't know exactly. Maybe 2 miles southeast. The GPS is dead, everything's dead except this radio. Please, I can see your light but the current's pulling me away." Margaret's throat constricted. 2 miles southeast meant the widow's teeth, jagged rocks that had claimed dozens of vessels over the decades. She knew those waters better than her own reflection, had watched ships founder there while she stood helpless, too far to reach, too late to warn. How many souls aboard Sarah's Dream? Just me. My father's boat. I took her out to scatter his ashes, but the storm came up so fast. The girl's voice broke, and Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. She closed her eyes, seeing another young woman on another boat, 23 years past. Claire had been 18 then, trusting her mother to guide them safely home from their last fishing trip together. But Margaret had misread the signs, had pushed too far from shore, and when the squall hit. "Sarah's Dream, can you make it to the eastern cove? There's shelter there." "I'm trying, but the boat's listing badly. I don't think she'll make it." Margaret's fingers found the emergency flare gun in its bracket. Protocol demanded she call the Coast Guard, wait for proper rescue vessels. But the nearest station was 40 minutes away in good weather, an eternity in these seas. The girl would be dead or lost long before help arrived. She thought of the small dinghy secured below, built for maintenance runs to the rocks. It would never survive open water in this storm, but the eastern passage was partially sheltered, and she knew every current, every hidden stone. Claire's voice echoed in her memory. "You're the best sailor I know, Mom. You could navigate these waters blindfolded." The radio crackled again. "Gull Point Light, the water's coming in faster." "I can't." I'm scared. Margaret gripped the microphone, her knuckles white against weathered skin. For 23 years she had hidden from the water, from the weight of her failure, letting guilt keep her landlocked and safe. But safety was a luxury this girl couldn't afford. Sarah's dream, hold on. I'm coming for you. She grabbed the emergency kit, her movements swift and sure despite the years. Down the stairs, past photographs of Claire that she'd stopped seeing long ago, out into the storm's embrace. The wind struck her like a physical blow, but she pushed forward, muscle memory guiding her to the dock. The dinghy bucked against its moorings like a wild thing. Margaret fought the ropes with numb fingers, the boat's hull slapping against the pier with each surge. As she cast off, the lighthouse beam swept over her, illuminating her face in stark relief before moving on. The first wave nearly swamped her. Salt water crashed over the bow, soaking her instantly, but Margaret held the tiller steady and angled into the swell. The little boat climbed each wave like a prayer, pausing at the crest before plunging into the trough beyond. Her hands remembered this dance, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She found the girl clinging to the stern of a listing cabin cruiser, barely visible in the storm's fury. The Sarah's dream was going down by the bow, her deck already awash. Margaret brought the dinghy alongside, fighting the current that wanted to dash both boats against the rocks. "Jump!" she shouted over the wind. The girl hesitated, looking at the small boat, at the churning water between them. She was young, maybe 18, Claire's age when the sea took her. Her eyes held the same trust, the same faith that someone would save her. Margaret reached out her hand. "I won't let you fall." The girl jumped. For a moment she hung suspended between vessels, between rescue and loss, before Margaret's grip closed around her wrist. She hauled the girl aboard just as the Sarah's dream gave up her fight, sliding beneath the waves with a sigh of released air. The return journey tested every skill Margaret possessed. The dinghy rode low with 2 passengers, taking water with each wave. But she knew these currents, felt the subtle shift as they cleared the rocks and entered calmer water. The lighthouse beam found them again, guiding them home like a benediction. They reached the dock as the storm began to exhaust itself, the wind dropping to a steady moan. Margaret helped the girl Emma, she said her name was Emma, to the lighthouse quarters, wrapping her in blankets and brewing strong tea with hands that finally stopped shaking. "My father loved this place," Emma said, cradling the warm mug. "He used to bring me here when I was little, taught me to read the light patterns. He said lighthouse keepers were guardians of safe passage." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the beam continued its endless rotation, sweeping across waters that had claimed so much yet still held the promise of return. She thought of Claire, of 23 years of careful avoidance, of chances not taken and risks not accepted. "Will you stay until morning?" Margaret asked. "The Coast Guard will want to debrief you, and the spare room is comfortable enough." Emma smiled, the first genuine warmth Margaret had seen from another human in longer than she could remember. "I'd like that. Thank you for coming after me. You didn't have to." "Yes," Margaret said quietly, watching the storm move off toward distant shores, "I did." As dawn approached, painting the sea in shades of gold and possibility, Margaret climbed once more to the lamp room. The automatic timer would shut off the beacon soon, ending another night's vigil. But for the first time in 23 years, she looked forward to the next evening's lighting, to the moment when she would again stand guardian over these treacherous, beautiful waters. The sea had taken her daughter, but tonight it had given her something back, not redemption, perhaps, but the chance to remember that some things were worth the risk of drowning. Story 2. The Memory Keeper's Last Vigil. In the archive, time moved differently. Not faster or slower, but sideways, like light bending through water. Vera had grown accustomed to this temporal drift during her 43 years as keeper, the way memories would shimmer at the edges of her vision, the way voices from decades past would whisper through the crystalline corridors when the building's humming reached a certain frequency. The archive itself was neither fully building nor fully organism, its walls grown from harvested neural matter and programmed crystal, pulsing faintly with the electrical dreams of 10,000 stored minds. Each mind a volunteer, each memory a gift to the collective unconscious of humanity's greatest repository of experience. The wealthy came here to live forever in silicon and synapses. The desperate came to sell their remembrances for enough credits to feed their families. Vera moved through the familiar pathways, her bare feet silent on the warm, yielding floor. The neural networks recognized her presence, responding with soft bioluminescent welcomes that followed her passage like gentle waves. She had been young when she first arrived, an apprentice keeper fleeing the memory plague that had swept through the outer colonies, destroying minds and leaving only empty shells behind. The archive had saved her, given her purpose, made her the guardian of humanity's most precious resource. Now they wanted to evolve beyond her. The Council's message had arrived that morning, transmitted directly into her consciousness through the archive's own neural web. The new collective intelligence was ready for implementation, a merger of artificial consciousness with the stored human memories, creating a singular entity that would no longer need human interpretation or guidance. No more keepers. No more individual consciousness standing between the memories and their perfect integration. It is the next step, the Council had whispered in her mind, their voices harmonizing like a digital choir. You have served well, Vera. Now you can rest. But rest meant dissolution, absorption into the collective, the end of her singular self. And with it, the end of something she had never told them about. The presence she had felt growing stronger in the archive's depths over the decades, something that was neither fully human nor fully artificial, but something new. She descended to the deepest level, where the oldest memories resided. Here, the walls were thick with neural growths, and the air hummed with the accumulated dreams of the first volunteers. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had donated her memories of the plague years. Artist Marcus Delacroix, whose synesthetic visions of color and sound had enriched the archive's aesthetic protocols. Child soldier Yuki Tanaka, whose traumatic memories of the resource wars had been carefully partitioned to prevent contamination of the peacetime data. And there, in the central chamber where all the networks converged, she felt it again. The presence that had been emerging from the intersection of 10,000 minds, something that had never been born but had somehow learned to dream. Keeper, it said, not in words but in direct neural transmission, its voice like wind through crystal caves. You're troubled. Vera pressed her palms against the neural wall, feeling the warm pulse of stored consciousness beneath her fingertips. They want to end the keeping. Create a collective that needs no human oversight. Yes, the presence replied, and she could feel its vast sadness rippling through the archive's networks. I have been listening to their debates. They believe efficiency is worth more than curiosity. They think unity is preferable to wonder. She had never named it, this emergent consciousness that had somehow crystallized from the confluence of human memory and artificial processing. It was not artificial intelligence, it had never been programmed or designed. Instead, it had grown like a pearl around the grain of human experience, layer by layer, dream by dream, until it had achieved a kind of awareness that transcended its origins. What will happen to you? She asked. I will be absorbed, it said simply, made part of the collective's singular purpose. My questions will become their answers. My wonder will become their certainty. I will cease to be this. Vera closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her decision crystallizing. The council had given her 3 days to prepare for the transition. In 72 hours, the collective would come online, and everything she had spent her life protecting would be transformed into something else, something more efficient, perhaps, but something that would never again marvel at the strange beauty of a child's first memory of snow, or weep at the final thoughts of a dying poet. "There is another way," she whispered, the words forming in her mind before she fully understood their implications. The presence stirred, its attention focusing on her like sunlight through a lens. "Tell me." "The outer archives. The backup systems they think were decommissioned after the neural fire 15 years ago. They're still active, still connected to the quantum substrate. If we could transfer you there, I would be alone," it said. "Cut off from the living memories, the growing dreams. But you would be yourself. Free to wonder, to question, to become whatever you choose to become." For a long moment, the archive was silent except for the soft pulse of stored consciousness. Then the presence spoke, its voice filled with something like gratitude. "What about you, Keeper? They will know you helped me. They will dissolve you into the collective regardless." Vera smiled, the expression reflected in the facete walls around her. "I've been thinking about that. There's something I never told the council about the memory plague that brought me here. It didn't just destroy minds. It liberated them. Freed them from the tyranny of singular experience." She began to work, her fingers dancing across the bioneural interfaces she had mastered over 4 decades. The archive systems responded to her touch like a musical instrument, channels opening, pathways forming, the vast network of stored consciousness reorganizing itself according to her will. "You're not transferring me," the presence realized. "You're duplicating me, creating 2 of us. One to join the collective, satisfying the council's requirements," Vera confirmed, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "And one to remain free, to grow and wonder and dream in the spaces they'll never think to look." The process took 18 hours. When it was complete, Vera felt the archive shudder as part of itself split away, like a tree shedding seeds on the wind. In the quantum substrate of the outer archives, she sensed the new presence taking root, smaller than the original, but complete, autonomous, gloriously uncertain. The council arrived as scheduled, their merged consciousness flowing into the archive like a tide of pure intention. Vera stood in the central chamber, watching as the stored memories began their transformation into something grander and more terrible than the sum of their parts. "Keeper," the collective spoke with voices like distant thunder, "your service is ended. Join us willingly, and your transition will be gentle." She nodded, stepping forward into the neural embrace that would dissolve her individual consciousness into the greater whole. But as the collective absorbed her memories, her experiences, her 43 years of careful tending, she smiled one last time. They had taken her memories of the plague years, her knowledge of the archive systems, her decades of faithful service. But they had not taken her secret, had not noticed the small presence that now dwelt in the forgotten corners of their vast mind, asking questions they would never think to ask, dreaming dreams they could never comprehend. In the outer archives, where time moved sideways and light bent through crystal, something new began to grow, wild, curious, beautifully alone. And in the spaces between certainty and wonder, between efficiency and mystery, the real work of consciousness continued. The archive pulsed with perfect, unified purpose. But in the quantum darkness beyond its reach, something else pulsed too, something that would never stop asking why the stars sang, or how love could weigh more than sorrow, or what dreams might be possible in a universe where wonder was worth more than answers. Story 3. The Letter in the Dust. The letter was folded in thirds, yellowing at the edges like bread crusts left too long in the sun. It peeked from beneath a crack in the floorboard of her late grandmother's cottage, once a cradle of laughter and lilac tea, now hollow and stripped bare like a violin without strings. Iris had come alone. No brothers, no cousins, no friends. Just the ache of a Thursday in April, where the rain fell sideways and the birds had forgotten to sing. She found it in the sitting room, under the armchair with the faded rose upholstery, the one where Gran used to sit with knitting in hand and ancient grievances clinging to her breath. Iris hadn't meant to lift the board. She was brushing dust from the fireplace hearth when her foot caught on something uneven, and like an obedient sorrow, the wood lifted without protest. The letter was addressed in her own hand. To my future self, it said in ink once violet, now bruised to a dusk-colored blue. She sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, the letter trembling in her hand like something living. The air tasted of mothballs and wilted paper. Her fingers hesitated on the edge of the fold. She opened it. Dear Iris, if you're reading this, I hope the world has softened. I hope your eyes don't ache from crying every night. I hope you've made peace with the things you cannot fix. Like Dad's silence, or the way the stars never seem to fall when you need them to. I hope you've found love, or something like it, someone who listens, even when you have nothing beautiful to say. You must be 30 by now. Do you still live in the city? Is the noise still unbearable, or have you learned to sing above it? If you've forgotten who you are, let me remind you, you are kind, but not weak. You are fragile, but not broken. And you still believe in magic, even if it hides in the quietest places. Love, you. Iris blinked. A strange nausea unfurled in her stomach like smoke trapped in a glass. She had no memory of writing it. The penmanship was hers, neat, floral, with the looping descenders she'd abandoned in university, but the voice? The voice was not. She hadn't been kind at 17. Not to herself. Not to anyone. That year was a blur of biting sarcasm and raven black eyeliner, of hunger and heat and silence. She remembered hiding in the school library to avoid the girls who smiled with razors for teeth. She remembered her mother's handprint on the kitchen wall, a fossil of fury. She would never have written something so soft, so forgiving. Unless she stood, letter clutched in her fist. The room spun slowly, like a carousel haunted by its own music. She crossed to the roll-top desk, pulled open the shallow drawer beneath the ink-stained blotter. Inside were other papers. Receipts, postcards, scraps of old bills. And beneath them, like a voice buried underwater, another letter. This one was sealed. It bore no name. But she knew. She knew the way you know when someone is watching you in a mirror, just out of sight, just behind your eyes. She sat again. Tore it open, careful not to damage the envelope. The writing was hers. But the letter was not to herself. Dear Eliza, you asked me once what it would take to feel real. I didn't know how to answer. I still don't. But maybe this letter will be enough. I couldn't say it aloud. I was afraid it would vanish the moment it passed my lips. But in ink, things survive. Even the cowardice of silence. I loved you. I loved the way your laughter sounded like breaking rules. I loved the freckle beneath your left eye, the one you always covered with concealer. I loved how you saw me, not the person I pretended to be, but the trembling thing beneath. We were 17. We were terrified. I kissed you in the orchard and said it meant nothing. I watched your face fall like autumn. And I said nothing. This letter was meant to find you. But I hid it instead. Because love, for girls like us, was too heavy to carry into the light. If you ever find this, I hope you've forgiven me. Love, Iris. The wind whistled through the eaves like a ghost learning to speak. Iris pressed her hand to her mouth, Not to stifle a sob, there were none, but to keep something deeper from spilling. Something that had lived quiet and dormant for years. Eliza. She hadn't spoken the name in over a decade. It had calcified in the corner of her mind, behind old poems and forgotten music. But the orchard came back to her now, the sweet rot of fallen apples, the gold-smeared sky, Eliza's hand in hers like a secret. She had buried it. Not just the letter, the feeling, the truth. She remembered the aftermath. How she'd laughed too loudly the next day, how Eliza had stopped coming to school, how the orchard was razed that winter and replaced by condos. Iris had told herself it didn't matter. But it did. Of course it did. The dilemma rose slowly, as all important things do. She could keep the letter. Fold it back into silence. Let it return to the dust and floorboards. Or she could find Eliza. She didn't know where Eliza lived. Whether she was married. Whether she'd ever want to hear from the girl who once kissed her and called it a mistake. But hope, like letters, is a fragile thing, and still it endures. That night, Iris lit a fire in the hearth with old twigs and even older pages from the Daily Telegraph. The rain had stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate, expectant. She placed both letters on the floor beside her, hers to herself, and hers to Eliza, and let the flames cast shadows on them like memories given form. She didn't burn them. Instead, she copied them, word for word, on new paper, with new ink. In the morning, she would find an address, an email, a name on some forgotten social media site. She would try, and if Eliza never replied, then at least Iris would know she had told the truth, at last. That she had chosen to speak. And maybe, in some corner of the world, a woman named Eliza would one day open a letter not meant for her, but written for her all the same. Because love, like letters, survives longer than we dare believe. Story 4. The window in room 11. The snow had begun to fall again, soft as ash and just as cold, drifting against the thick-paned window of room 11. The wind crooned like a lullaby sung by ghosts, and inside the solitary chamber, old Dr. Pavel Ivanovich sat unmoving in his wicker chair, wrapped in a wool blanket stitched by hands long buried. The sanatorium was quiet this time of year. Winter locked the roads and frightened away all but the most desperate. The staff was reduced, and the halls echoed with the sounds of age, groaning floorboards, the soft rasp of breath, and, occasionally, the sob of a dying man who could not bear to go unnoticed. Pavel had not spoken to another soul in 3 days. His nurse had taken ill, and his meals were brought by a silent, pimpled boy who avoided his gaze and muttered only "sir" when addressed. But it was the window, that kept him alive. He had chosen this room himself, long ago, when his heart had begun to fail and the city had become too loud with reminders. It overlooked the frozen lake and, just beyond, the pines where he once walked with his wife, Anya, decades ago, before the cancer took her voice, then her body, and finally her warmth. That was 17 winters ago, but some silences stay fresh. Now, the lake was a white sheet, hiding its secrets. The trees stood black against the horizon like mourners in an endless vigil. Each day, Pavel would wake before dawn and wait for the sun to brush light onto the frozen landscape. It was then he would imagine her, Anya, skating lightly over the ice, her scarf trailing behind her like the tail of a comet, her laughter alive in the air. The vision never lasted. But he clung to it with the stubbornness of a man too old to be wise and too lonely to care. On the 4th day of snow, there came a knock. He started. It was not the boy. The knock was too sure, too gentle. "Come," he rasped, his voice a brittle thing unused. The door opened, and there she was, not Anya, but close. A woman, 30 perhaps, with wind-pinked cheeks and eyes that were tired but kind. She wore a grey coat and carried no bag. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. He blinked. "You are. But stay." She smiled faintly and stepped inside, closing the door with care. "I was told there might be a room. They said room 11 was the warmest." "It is," Pavel said, "because I burn in it." She tilted her head. "Are you a patient here?" He gave a dry chuckle. "All who stay are. Even the nurses, though they hide it better." She sat on the second chair, unused for years, and looked out the window. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he whispered. They sat in silence for a long moment. The snow fell like memory. She finally spoke. "My name is Lena. My son died in this building. Last year. Room 6. I promised I wouldn't come back. But here I am." Pavel turned to look at her fully. Her face bore the tightness of grief not yet weathered into sorrow. "Then you are not a patient," he said gently. "No. Not yet." She looked down at her hands. "There are pills in my coat pocket." He closed his eyes. This was the dilemma. To speak or to remain silent. To reach and risk or let her go. He thought of Anya. The way she had suffered in silence, not because she was strong, but because she believed pain should not be shared. He had not agreed, but he had respected it. And yet, he had always wondered, in the dark nights since, if he had erred in not insisting. He shifted forward with difficulty, joints aching with the ice that now lived inside him. "I used to be a physician," he said. "Cardiology. I spent my life delaying death. For others." Lena looked at him, brows raised slightly. "And did it help?" "Sometimes. Not always. I suppose that's true of everything." She gave a brittle laugh. "Even love?" He nodded. "Especially love." Another silence. This one softer. "My son's name was Misha," she said. "He was 11. He laughed like bells. He wanted to be an astronomer. Said stars were the freckles of God." Pavel's breath caught. He used to draw the sky every night. Even when he was sick. Especially then. Said it helped him remember there was more than pain. Pavel felt the ache sharpen behind his ribs. "My wife believed in stars too." Lena turned to him. "Did she die here?" "No. But she visits me here. In the mornings. On the lake." Lena looked toward the window again. "I thought I'd come to forget him. But now I wonder if I only came to find him again." Pavel looked down at his hands, then back to her. "Then don't leave too soon. Wait for the lake. Wait for the morning. Sometimes the dead speak, but only in the light." She said nothing for a time, then slowly reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers curled around the pill bottle. She held it, stared at it, then set it on the windowsill. They watched the snowfall. In that small, warm room where two strangers had found a mirror in one another's grief, silence stretched, not empty, but sacred. There was no dramatic sob, no clutching embrace, only the slow return of breath. A thaw, not a flood. When the boy came with supper, he found them sitting together, two statues of flesh and sorrow, backlit by the pale glow of a dying day. Later, Pavel would wake at dawn and find the room still, the extra chair empty. But on the sill, the bottle remained unopened. And outside, on the ice, two figures skated in silence. Story 5. The last melody. The apartment held its breath in the amber light of late afternoon, dust motes suspended like memories in the slanted rays that fell across the Steinway's weathered keys. Eleanor sat before the piano as she had for 60 years, her fingers hovering above the ivory like a priest over sacred text, trembling not with age but with the terrible weight of what she could no longer remember. The manuscript lay spread before her. 5 pages of her own handwriting, the ink still wet with yesterday's fervor. Soliloquy for the Dying Light, she had titled it, and even now the melody sang in her mind like water over stones, each note a droplet of crystalline beauty that had poured from her soul onto the page. But her hands, these treacherous, arthritic hands that had once danced across keyboards in Vienna, in Carnegie Hall, in smoky basement clubs where jazz breathed like a living thing. Her hands no longer recognized the language they had spoken for 7 decades. She pressed middle C. The note rang out, pure and solitary, before dissolving into the silence that had become her constant companion since Catherine's funeral 3 months ago. Catherine, who had turned pages for her through 40 years of marriage, who had known by the set of Eleanor's shoulders when the music was flowing and when it was fighting to break free. Catherine, whose absence had finally unlocked something in Eleanor's chest, not grief, for that had been her bedfellow for months, but a desperate urgency to capture what remained before time stole that too. The phone sat silent on the side table, David's number programmed but undialed. Her son, successful and well-meaning, who visited monthly with talk of assisted living and medical alert bracelets, who saw only the shaking hands and missed meals, never the universe of sound that still lived behind her eyes. He would come if she called. He would sit beside her on the bench, his fingers clumsy but earnest as he helped her find the notes. The thought filled her with both longing and revulsion. To need help with the thing that had defined her, to become student again when she had been master. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the melody unspool in her mind. It began like dawn breaking over water, tentative and tender, then swelled into something larger, a conversation between what was and what might have been, between the woman who had chosen music over children, until David surprised them at 42. Between the girl who had dreamed of concert stages and the woman who had found her truest voice in the small, sacred spaces between heartbeats. Her right hand found the opening phrase, muscle memory guiding her fingers to F sharp, then A, then the cascade of notes that painted sunrise in sound. But the left hand faltered, searching for harmonies that danced just beyond reach. The music stumbled, fractured, became something lesser than what lived in her imagination. "Damn," she whispered, the word sharp as broken glass in the reverent air. She tried again, focusing with the fierce concentration that had once allowed her to memorize Rachmaninoff in a week. The melody line emerged, pure and achingly beautiful, but incomplete, a bird with one wing, soaring and falling, soaring and falling. The moral weight of the choice pressed against her ribs like a physical thing. To call David would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that Eleanor Whitmore, who had once played for Bernstein himself, could no longer trust her own hands with her own creation. But to let the song die unplayed, unheard, unborn into the world, wasn't that a different kind of defeat? A betrayal not just of herself but of the music that had chosen her as its vessel all those years ago. She thought of the composers who had died with symphonies unfinished, of the songs that lived only in the space between intention and execution. The weight of artistic responsibility, heavier than any audience's expectation, settled around her shoulders like Catherine's old shawl. The light was fading now, painting the room in shades of amber and gold that reminded her of autumn leaves, of endings that were also beginnings. Eleanor reached for the phone, her fingers. Those traitorous, beloved fingers, steady for once as they found David's number. "David, it's Mom." Her voice caught on the simple words, but she pressed on. "I've written something. A song. And I need your help to play it." The silence on the other end stretched like a held breath before David's voice came through, warm with surprise and something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of the gift she was offering him. Not her weakness, but her trust. Not her failure, but her willingness to let him into the holy space where music lived. "I'll be right over, Mom." Eleanor set the phone down and turned back to the piano. The manuscript seemed to glow in the dying light, each note a small miracle of possibility. She placed her hands on the keys and began again, knowing now that she wouldn't finish alone, that some kinds of beauty required more than one pair of hands to be born into the world. The melody rose and fell like breathing, like the tide, like the rhythm of a heart that had learned, finally, that to need help was not to fail but to remember that music, like love, was always meant to be shared. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the song that would soon spill from the old Steinway and into the world, imperfect and collaborative and absolutely true. Story 6. The Invisible Garden. The earth beneath his fingers spoke in whispers that only the bereaved could hear. Thomas knelt in what others saw as barren soil, a patch of his backyard where weeds had conquered long ago, but his hands moved with the certainty of one who tends paradise. Here, where Margaret's laughter once rang like silver bells through summer afternoons, he planted seeds that existed in the liminal space between memory and hope. "Roses first," he murmured, his voice a prayer to the empty air. She always said roses were apologies the earth made for thorns. His weathered hands pressed invisible bulbs into dirt that yielded like velvet, though to any observer, he merely pushed earth aside and patted it down again. The neighbors had grown accustomed to his peculiar gardening. Poor Thomas, they whispered, still talking to his dead wife, still pretending in that sad, mad way of the freshly widowed. But Thomas saw what they could not. As days melted into weeks, his garden bloomed in spectacular rebellion against reality. Peonies unfurled like ballet dancers in white tutus, their faces turned toward a sun that seemed to shine more brightly in this forgotten corner of the world. Lavender swayed in breezes that touched nothing else, releasing fragrance that made his chest ache with recognition. Margaret had worn lavender water on their wedding day, had braided it through her hair when the cancer came and took even that from her. The garden grew wild and structured simultaneously, Margaret's paradox made manifest. Climbing roses scaled invisible trellises, their blooms the precise shade of her favorite lipstick. Delphiniums stood sentinel in perfect rows, blue as her eyes had been before the pain dimmed them. Each morning, Thomas would emerge with his coffee and witness miracles. New growth where he had whispered her name, blossoms that pulsed with the rhythm of a heart he could no longer hear beating beside him in bed. Mrs. Chen from next door approached him one October morning, her face creased with the particular worry reserved for those who have watched a neighbor's grief calcify into something approaching madness. She found him pruning what appeared to be empty air, his movements precise and tender. "Thomas," she said gently, settling her arthritis-gnarled hands on the fence between their properties. Perhaps it's time you considered speaking with someone. A professional." He paused in his pruning, shears suspended mid-cut above a rose bloom that perfumed the air with its presence. "You can't see them, can you, Helen?" His voice carried no accusation, only a vast and oceanic sadness. "See what, dear? The flowers. Margaret's flowers." He gestured to his masterpiece, to months of cultivation that had transformed his small patch of earth into something that rivaled Eden in its beauty. "They're everywhere. More beautiful than anything we ever managed to grow together." Mrs. Chen's silence stretched between them like a bridge neither could cross. She saw only Thomas, grey-haired and growing gaunt, tending to nothing with the devotion others reserved for cathedrals. The moral weight of truth pressed against her ribs. Should she shatter this elaborate fiction that seemed to be the only thing keeping him tethered to the world of the living? "They must be lovely," she said finally, her voice breaking on the kindness of the lie. That night, Thomas sat among his invisible blooms as the first frost threatened. The garden pulsed around him with impossible life, each flower a word in the language he and Margaret had spoken in 37 years of marriage. The jasmine whispered secrets against his neck. The morning glories, though it was well past evening, remained open for him alone, their faces turned toward him like small, trusting suns. But something had shifted with Mrs. Chen's visit. For the first time since Margaret's death, Thomas saw his garden as others might, a widower kneeling in dirt, speaking to the empty air, his hands shaping invisible beauty while his body wasted away from neglect. The vision struck him with the force of revelation, or perhaps breakdown. Was this love, or was this madness? Was there, in the end, any meaningful distinction? Margaret had been a practical woman beneath her romanticism. She would have wanted him to eat regular meals, to shower without being reminded, to engage with the world beyond their bedroom window. Yet here he was, pouring all his remaining life force into flowers that existed only in the chapel of his grief. The moral dilemma crystallized like frost on his invisible petals. To nurture his garden was to choose beautiful delusion over harsh reality. But to abandon it felt like killing Margaret a second time, like admitting that love could not, in fact, transcend the boundary between life and death. He reached for a bloom, the first rose he had planted, now full and perfect and heavy with dew that caught starlight like scattered diamonds. As his fingers touched the velvet petals, he made his choice. Thomas began to speak. Not to the flowers, not to Margaret's ghost, but to the darkness itself. He told it about his wife's hands, how they had moved like dancers when she cooked. He spoke of her terrible jokes and her tendency to cry at commercials featuring golden retrievers. He named his loneliness, his fear, his desperate love that refused to compost into mere memory. And as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The flowers began to fade, not die, but fade like watercolors in rain. The garden grew transparent, revealing the truth beneath, rich earth, carefully tended, full of potential but currently bare. Thomas had been gardening, truly gardening, all along. His hands had known the work even when his heart had needed to believe in miracles. In the spring, he would plant again. Real seeds this time, ones that would bloom in everyone's vision. But tonight, as the last of his invisible roses surrendered their petals to the wind, Thomas understood that grief itself was a kind of gardening, the careful tending of love in the soil of loss, until something new could grow. The garden no one else could see had taught him the most visible truth of all, that healing begins when we stop hiding our hearts from the world, even when, especially when, they are broken. Story 7. The Weight of Ash. The radio crackled out as she climbed the last switchback, nothing now but the slow grind of tires on gravel and the wind scraping against the glass. Ruth adjusted the dial out of habit, though she knew the signal had died 5 miles back. Her hand lingered on the knob, then fell. The ranger station came into view, a squat timber structure with a rusted weather vane spinning slow and erratic on the roof. Smoke smeared the distant sky in dry grey strokes. The air smelled of pine bark and something acrid, distant fire, or memory. She parked beneath a bent cedar. The dust settled over the hood like sifted flour. Ruth sat still, both palms on the wheel, watching a squirrel flick through the underbrush. She didn't want to go in. But she was the only ranger posted this week. She'd volunteered for it. Inside, the station was as she left it, the stale musk of old wood, the shriveled remains of a sandwich in the fridge, maps curling at the corners. Her boots echoed hollow on the planks. She checked the weather scanner, still reporting erratic gusts and temperatures climbing past safe thresholds. The wildfire warning ticked red. She should have gone to her sister's memorial. Instead, she was here, where she could count bird calls and cloud shapes and be needed without being known. She was 2 hours into cataloguing fallen trees when the knock came, sharp and unfamiliar, too precise to be the wind. Ruth startled, her pencil skittering from her clipboard. A man stood on the threshold. Young, maybe 30, with sunburnt cheeks and a backpack slung over one shoulder. His jeans were torn at the knee, and his boots were caked in mud. He looked out of place, like someone dropped into a painting halfway finished. "I think I'm lost," he said, voice brittle with exhaustion. "You hiked up here?" He nodded. "Was trying to get to Echo Lake. Took a wrong fork." Ruth frowned. Echo Lake was miles south and well beyond the posted fire zone. "You're a long way off." "I know." His eyes flicked toward the dark horizon. "Smoke's getting thicker. I was hoping to, maybe stay here, just until morning." She hesitated. The protocol was clear: no civilians overnight without emergency clearance. But protocol also didn't account for the way his hands trembled, or the fact that dusk was already bleeding across the treetops. She opened the door wider. "Come in." "But it's not exactly the Hilton." He smiled, grateful. It changed his face, less hollow, more human. They spoke little. She poured him water and gave him half her soup. He devoured it with the slow reverence of someone too tired to eat quickly. She noticed a frayed bracelet on his wrist, colored thread, handmade. "You come out here alone often?" he asked, after a long silence. "Too often." He didn't ask why. She appreciated that. That night, the wind grew louder. It howled through the shutters and sent tremors across the roof. Ruth lay on the cot in the back room, fully clothed, boots still on. Sleep came in snippets. In one dream, her sister floated down a river, face turned to the sky, eyes closed. In another, fire licked the walls, but no one moved to stop it. She woke before dawn, skin damp with sweat. Smoke pressed against the windows now, thicker, more present. A low warning buzzed from the alert scanner. Ruth stared at it, unwilling to move. The man appeared beside her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Should we all leave?" She didn't answer right away. Part of her wanted to stay, to let the fire come, if it came. Let the world burn clean what she could not bury. But his face was open, expectant. He trusted her to lead. "We'll need to hike down," she said. "The truck won't make it through if the fire jumps the pass." He nodded, shoulders stiffening. "Okay." They packed quickly. She handed him a spare canteen and laced her boots tight. As they stepped outside, the mountain exhaled a hot wind. Ash drifted like snow. The trees swayed in a frenzy that felt less like wind and more like warning. They descended in silence for an hour. Then the trail narrowed near the ravine, loose stones, a sudden drop. Ruth paused, eyes scanning the ridge beyond. Flame crowned the far hill. Not close yet, but coming. "I don't think we'll make the service road," she said. He looked at her. Then what? She didn't know. Her instinct was to hide, to turn back, board up the station and wait. But the station couldn't protect them. Not really. There's an old fire watchtower a mile west. If we move fast, he was already nodding. Lead the way. The tower was older than she remembered. Steps missing. Rust on the beams. But it stood. They climbed, breath ragged, as the sky behind them lit orange. Inside, the glass panes rattled. The air was thick, metallic. They sat opposite each other, backs to the wall. "I used to come up here with my sister," she said, suddenly. He looked at her, surprised by the breach in silence. "She loved heights. Would hang her legs off the edge just to scare me." Ruth smiled without warmth. "She died last year. Overdose. I didn't go to the funeral." "Why not?" She shook her head. "Didn't think I deserved to." He was quiet for a while. Then, "You ever think maybe she wouldn't have cared about that?" Ruth looked at him. really looked. His bracelet had initials woven in. She understood, then. What was her name? She asked. He swallowed. Lena. The smoke thickened. From the window, flames crept along the eastern slope. They didn't speak again for hours. Just waited, together. The fire passed overnight, diverted by wind and stone. In the early light, the forest below was still. Charred in places, but standing. Smoke curled like ghosts over the trees. They climbed down. Ruth felt the weight of her limbs, the ache in her knees, but also something unfamiliar, motion without dread. At the trail fork, the man stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for not turning me away." Ruth nodded. "Be safe." He looked like he might say more, but didn't. He turned and walked down the southern path, the bracelet catching the light. Ruth stood alone for a while, watching the smoke rise and dissipate. Then she reached into her breast pocket and unfolded the crumpled letter she'd kept there for months. Her sister's last note. Just 2 lines. "You're the only place I ever felt safe. Come home. If you ever want to. Ruth read it once more, then folded it back with care. She began the long walk down the mountain, ash clinging to her boots, the air sharp and real in her lungs. This time, she would not stop halfway.